Antipodes, Chapter 14, Part 2. Incendia's eyes grew wide. For the first time, Jigsaw saw actual fear in them. When the green light flashed, she turned to Jigsaw and Tiptoe and smashed the button on the teleporter on her shoulder. After another jarring transition, they were back in the underground atrium with the holographic projector, though it was now only projecting a single, weakly lit red bar. Cerulean was already present, but the two unidentified ponies were gone. Incendia glanced at Cerulean, who said,
"Gone. No idea where they could have gone."
Incendia nodded.
"Oh, what are we going to do?"
She said. Panic was seeping into her voice, and it was clear to Jigsaw and Tiptoe that she had no idea what to do next. Cerulean didn't answer. She didn't look as frightened, but she was extremely tense. Suddenly an image burst into being above the table. Rubidium's head was floating above the table, as large as a small building. Tiptoe gasped and Jigsaw let out a shout. Incendia cantered up the table and stood in front of the projection. Rubidium chuckled.
"Incendia, glad to see you're still kicking, so to speak. I heard about your leg. I suppose you've noticed our little situation with the shield,"
he said.
"What have you done?"
Incendia demanded. Rubidium laughed a cold, humorless laugh, and his head moved out of the image. Behind it could be seen the attenuator's body with what appeared to be a stab wound in her chest. Incendia stared in shocked disbelief until Rubidium stepped back into the image. She took a deep breath and spoke in a voice that sounded uncharacteristically weak and shaky.
"You've signed your own death warrant." "Have I?"
said Rubidium.
"If only there were some replacement for the attenuator handy."
His eyes turned to Jigsaw.
"I'm not going to mince words. You have about 15 minutes before Tantalus gets here. You can either get here before that happens and restart the shield, or you can die along with the rest of the city. I'll be waiting."
His horn began to glow red, and he let out another cruel laugh. The image went dark. Jigsaw spoke first.
"I have to go. I don't have any other choice. Staying means that the entire city would die, and I can't allow that."
Tiptoe spoke next.
"You can't go. You'll be stuck there for hundreds of years or more, just like that other pony. It would be a fate worse than death, and all the other ponies would still be living in fear and oppression. I say we focus on fighting Tantalus." "Impossible,"
Incendia interjected.
"He's much too powerful. There's a reason we needed the power of a goddess to stop him from attacking." "I think I might have a plan,"
Cerulean said.
"but it's dangerous and might not end well forever."
They never got to find out the rest of Cerulean's plan because at that moment the entire room shook. The metal groaned and creaked.
"Oh no, he miscalculated." "What do you mean?"
Jigsaw said in alarm.
"Miscalculated what?"
"Tantalus," Incendia said quietly.
"He's already here."
This time Cerulean pressed her teleporter button. The world melted away, only to reform itself a moment later. They were standing in another slum, though in a completely different position. The sun was eclipsed behind the tower, and as such the light from the moon was the only thing that illuminated the buildings. They stood still in the street in silence for a few moments, until a massive roar shook the buildings.
"Run!"
shouted Incendia. The group took off towards the edge of the city, along with what seemed like most of the ponies in the city. Soon a huge crowd was galloping towards the border, but after only a few minutes of this, Jigsaw stopped and let out a cry of anguish. A splitting pain had suddenly begun in his horn, pain so intense it froze him in his tracks.
"What is it? What's wrong?"
Tiptoe said. Her answer came in the form of green flames that suddenly burst into life around the border of the city. Several ponies that had been galloping towards the border couldn't stop in time and ran right into the flames. The flames flashed in intensity for a brief moment before returning to their jade green color, leaving no trace of the ponies behind. The group stared in horror at the scene unfolding before them. Ponies began running in every direction, and before long the streets were mostly clear.
What do we do now?
Tiptoe said.
I still have one idea.
Cerulean said.
The portal in Rubidium's throne room might be able to get us out of here. I have no idea where it would send us, but you two managed to make it work before, so who knows?
Jigsaw and Tiptoe weren't afforded the opportunity to think it over. An enormously loud roar echoed out from somewhere on their left, and a glance revealed that Tantalus had taken off and was now flying towards the tower. A green corona surrounded him as he flew, leaving swirls and whirls of green mist in his wake. Underneath him, the scene was grisly. The green fire that was blazing at the city edges seemed to follow in his wake, setting alight the shabby shacks and buildings beneath it. As he flew on, the fire lost its green lighting and became orange. Screaming could be heard coming from the burning sections of the city.
We have to help them!
Shouted Incendia. She began galloping towards the blazing fires to the east.
Wait, don't run towards them!
Jigsaw shouted. Incendia didn't stop to respond. Jigsaw and Tiptoe shared a glance and made a snap decision. They took after her, Cerulean hot on their heels. They ran through the rubble of what had once been a row after row of shabby huts, now reduced to flaming wreckage. As they ran, Tiptoe dodged around a metal beam and lost her footing. She tumbled to the ground. She recovered quickly though, sitting up and shaking her head. She looked back to see what she had tripped over and screamed in horror. The body of a bright green earth pony was strewn over a small sheet of plastic. Hearing the scream, Jigsaw looked back at Tiptoe only to see her staring in horror at the body of the earth pony.
Stop!
He shouted. His voice held such authority that even Incendia stopped. When she turned to see the scene behind her, her face fell. Jigsaw galloped over to the now sobbing Tiptoe.
Tiptoe,
he began.
I know it's awful. I know it's sad. I've seen my fair share of dead ponies in the caves back home, but we can't stop now.
He lifted Tiptoe up from the ground and towards him.
Look around. If we don't move now, we'll end up just like that. We may still have a chance to save them if we leave now.
Tiptoe looked up and nodded slowly. She got to her hooves and joined the main group.
Are you alright, Tiptoe?
Incendia asked.
I think so. I've never seen a dead pony before. Not in real life and not like that. Seeing the attenuator run through was awful, but this is something else.
Her expression slowly hardened, and she looked up into Incendia's face.
They're going to pay for this, both of them. That's the spirit,
Incendia said, though she didn't look entirely sure of herself.
Now we have work to do.
They galloped for a few more minutes through the rubble until they had reached the spot where Tantalus had taken off. The destruction was almost unimaginable. Ponies were running madly through the streets, many on fire. The sound of explosions and screaming drowned out the cackling of the fires that still raged all around them. Incendia's horn began to glow, and suddenly Jigsaw understood why she had taken off towards the fire. She was extinguishing it. As her horn glowed more intensely, the flames around her grew smaller until they went out completely. It was costing her a great effort, however, as she could only extinguish a small area at once. Jigsaw glanced nervously at Tantalus, who at this point was nearly at the tower.
Incendia?
He said.
Noble as this is, if we don't leave now, he's going to destroy the tower. I know!
Incendia replied through gritted teeth.
That's why you have to go on without me. Cerulean, you know what to do. We're not leaving you.
Jigsaw shouted over the roar of sun.
We're all getting out.
He didn't get a chance to finish his sentence. Cerulean had pressed on her shoulder teleporter, and the three ponies had vanished, leaving Incendia behind. The familiar lights and colors surrounded Jigsaw for a moment, but just before the normal moment of departure came, Jigsaw felt the familiar splitting pain in his horn, and the colored lights began to fly past with increasing speed and ferocity. The pressure on all sides of Jigsaw increased, far past the point of Incendia's teleporter. Jigsaw was gasping for breath and unable to fill his lungs. The colors flying past began to slowly turn into the same bright green shade as Tantalus's fires. Then with one final, nearly unbearable compression, the world righted itself. Jigsaw had just enough time to see Cerulean and Tiptoe fall to the ground before he too slumped over, unconscious. Rubidium paced around the attenuator's room. He was fuming with rage. The leftover protection from the fragment should have slowed Tantalus more than it had. His only option now was to fight. His horn glowed blood red as the latches on the attenuator's table undid themselves. The attenuator's body slid off the table and fell to the floor in a heap. Rubidium stood on the platform and his horn glowed even brighter. The attenuation rods in the ceiling rotated in their sockets, and once again the white beams of energy shot from them. Rubidium was flung backwards by the force of the energy flowing into him. He tumbled off the table and was forced into the far wall. The attenuation rods faithfully adjusting their angle to continue their stream uninterrupted. Rubidium writhed in pain on the ground of the chamber. Then as quickly as it had begun, the flow of energy ceased. Rubidium lay on the floor of a chamber, curled into a ball for a few moments, smoke rising off his horn. Then with a moan of pain he stood up and opened his eyes. His horn began to glow and his eyes soon followed suit. He bellowed out a laugh, and a ring of red energy rippled out from his horn, shattering the windows of the chamber. Jigsaw woke to Tiptoe's shouts. He opened his eyes to see her standing above him, saying,
Thanks, Celestia, you're awake. We have to run.
The scene around them was hellish. They were clearly in the upper areas of the city, with its tall, sleek buildings, but it looked as though they had been hit just as hard as the other areas. The spires were almost all missing their points. Fires raged out of control. Buildings were crumbling from all sides, raining flaming wreckage down on the street, which had now had massive cracks and leaked a prismatic fluid that shone with all the colors of the rainbow.
How long was I out? What happened?
Jigsaw asked.
Tantalus interfered with the teleportation,
Cerulean said.
We are very close to the tower, however. When we get inside, we should be able to take the teleporters up. Those will be much harder to interfere with. He knows we're here?
Jigsaw asked, aghast.
It would appear so, but I think he's more worried about Rubidium at the moment.
Cerulean responded.
What do you mean worried? What does he have to be worried about?
Jigsaw asked. His answer came in the form of a sudden blast of heat and light. The pain in his horn returned in full strength, as it took everything he had to keep standing.
What in Equestria was that?
He asked.
Look behind you.
Jigsaw whipped his head around in time to see Tantalus bring down his massive fist on a ball of red light that was standing on the street less than 300 yards away. With the strike, another blast of light and heat hit, refreshing the pain in his horn. He didn't need any further convincing. Without another word, the three ponies took off in the opposite direction of the battling forces, towards the tower. The tower was in bad shape. Large chunks of it were missing, and small waves of energy were pulsing from cords hanging from the severed rooms, causing them to twitch unsettlingly like tentacles. The wind began to pick up behind them, and Tiptoe looked over her shoulder at the battle between Rubidium and Tantalus. Behind Tantalus, one of the taller buildings had been uprooted and was floating in a hazy green field over Rubidium. Tantalus raised his claws upward, then brought them down in a sweeping motion. The tower plowed into the ball of red light surrounding Rubidium, and the familiar blast of energy was released, though it seemed to be magnified tenfold with the force of the impact.
Get behind the building!
Tiptoe shouted in horror as a wave of fiery debris flew through the air towards them. Jigsaw and Tiptoe dove into a side alley, but Cerulean wasn't as fast on her hooves. A flying shard of metal struck her in the side as she turned to jump into the alleyway, and she landed inside in a heap and let out a cry of pain. Jigsaw gasped and ran over to her. The shard of metal was embedded so deep in her midsection that it was protruding from the other side. Blood was gouting from both sides of the wound, and Cerulean was giving horrific, gasping sobs. The color was rapidly draining away from her blue coat. The battlefield seemed to have grown calm for the time being. The only sounds that could be heard were the crumbling of far-off buildings and the crackling of burning fires.
Don't worry about this,
Tiptoe said through her tears.
It's all going to be alright. We can make it through this. Just don't die, for the love of Luna, don't die!
Tiptoe was crying now too. Blood was beginning to pool under Cerulean, matting her fur. Cerulean looked up at Tiptoe and took a deep, wheezing breath to control her gasping.
At the lobby teleporter, enter 62442. Select the green setting. It will take you where you need to go.
She coughed, and bright crimson blood spattered out of her mouth and onto the wall next to her. With what was supreme effort on her part, she looked up and whispered two words to Tiptoe.
Good luck.
With that, her head fell to the ground. The blood stopped spurting out of the wound and slowed to a trickle. Tiptoe's sobbing grew more intense, and she threw her front legs around Cerulean's body. Jigsaw approached and placed his head on Tiptoe's. His horn glowed with a soft blue light, and Cerulean's eyelids slid shut.
We have to go now, or her sacrifice will have been in vain,
Jigsaw said, barely audible over the sounds of collapsing rubble outside. Tiptoe stood up and nodded, though her eyes didn't dry. Jigsaw peered around the corner of the alleyway and, seeing it was clear, signed for Tiptoe to keep following him. Together they galloped out into the street and headed towards the tower. However, the calm didn't last long. They were only a few yards out from the entrance when the sharp pain in Jigsaw's horn returned, and a beam of light shot out from behind them. Jigsaw chose to ignore it. They were rapidly approaching the doors to the tower now. With one final sprint they barreled through the remains of the ornate doors and into the lobby. Once inside, Jigsaw didn't waste any time. His horn began to glow with a blue light, and the holographic display burst into life above the teleporter. He entered in the code Cerulean had said, and soon a green light was blazing above the platform.
Get on!
Jigsaw called. Stepping onto the platform, Tiptoe complied, and the two vanished with a flash of light. A moment later, they appeared in a dark stone hallway that was shaking as though it was in an earthquake. Dust was crumbling from the walls with every tremor.
Where are we?
Tiptoe shouted over the muffled sounds of explosions and the rumbling of the walls. Jigsaw looked around and saw something familiar. A large, ornately carved stone doorway, symbols glowing almost blindingly white.
It's the doorway to the fragment of Celestia.
Jigsaw shouted to Tiptoe.
Why would Cerulean send us here? She said it would take us where we needed to be. What if we're supposed to take the fragment with us? To stop Tantalus from getting his claws on it? Are you insane?
Tiptoe shouted.
How will we even take it with us? I don't know,
replied Jigsaw.
But we have to try something. Why else would she have sent us here?
Jigsaw approached the door, and the symbols on it began to flow and transform themselves into new orientations. The sun and moon insignia on the door blazed golden, and the door slid open. Jigsaw entered cautiously, his eyes trained on the object in the center of the room. The fragment of Celestia in the center of the room seemed to have swollen to twice the size it was when Jigsaw had seen it before. It still had the appearance of a miniature sun, but it was now cycling through colors. The golden yellow glow it normally had was being interrupted by flashes of green and red. Jigsaw's horn began to buzz with the raw power of the fragment. He approached it slowly and cautiously, trying to think how he could transport it off the platform it was on. He attempted to lift it with magic, but the buzzing in his horn simply got more intense, and the miniature sun got more agitated, flashing red and green at an even greater speed. Experimentally, Jigsaw reached out a hoof and lightly tapped the surface of the sphere. To his surprise, there was no pain. It felt soft and pleasantly warm. Jigsaw then nodded, lowered his horn, and touched the point of it to the sphere. A high-pitched whining began to emanate from the center of the room, and the buzzing in Jigsaw's horn grew in intensity until he could barely stand it. He attempted to wrench his horn away from the sphere, but it was impossible.
Jigsaw!
Tiptoe shouted. She ran towards him, but when she got to the doorway, some invisible barrier stopped her from entering. The air in front of her seemed to ripple like the surface of a pool. She threw herself into it nonetheless, attempting to break through to Jigsaw, who was now screaming. The sphere was growing brighter and brighter. Then, with a sudden whoosh of air and final flash of golden light, the fragment disappeared. The barrier in front of the door vanished and Tiptoe tumbled in. Jigsaw, miraculously, was still standing. His horn had taken on the appearance of the sphere. Swirling pools of golden light flowed along its length.
Jigsaw, are you okay? What happened to the fragment?
Tiptoe said.
I'm fine, Tiptoe. I'm not sure what happened. I think the fragments enter into me, somehow. What?
Tiptoe said in shock.
How do you know? I can feel it. I don't really know how to describe it. It's like a buzzing sensation in my horn.
As he spoke, the golden light faded from his horn, and darkness returned to the room. Jigsaw instinctively lit his horn, flooding the room with the cool, blue light.
Does this mean you have the powers of the sphere now?
Tiptoe said.
Can you use them to beat Tantalus?
Jigsaw cocked his head to one side.
No, Tiptoe, it's not like that. It's not something I can draw upon. It's just there. I think this is what the ability to attenuate is for. I think it's for transporting the fragments, to bring them back together.
The end of his sentence was punctuated with a massive blast that nearly shook them off their hooves.
We need to get out of here at any rate,
Jigsaw said.
Get to the elevator.
They quickly galloped through the hallway to the glass elevator. The platform was resting slightly off level at the bottom of the tube. Jigsaw stepped on and pressed one of the smooth buttons on the side of the platform. Nothing happened.
Okay, hold on,
Jigsaw said as he lit his horn. The platform was surrounded by a blue aura and began to shoot up the tube. Fortunately, the two appeared to be intact, and after a few minutes of rising rapidly, they reached the throne room. The view from the windows was obscured by the smoke that was billowing up from the ruins of the city below. Jigsaw and Tiptoe quickly crossed the room. They stood on the platform where their stallion-grad journey had begun. With the familiar golden light, the grey rock melted into crystal and opened like a gaping mouth and swallowed up the two ponies. The red glow had almost completely vacated Rubidium, and Tantalus raised his claw and brought it smashing down on top of him again. His coat was turning darker and lines and creases had begun appearing on his face. It was only a matter of time now. Tantalus gathered as much energy as he could and let out a torrent of green flames from his reptilian snout. He felt the protection of the shield give way, and in a final burst of red light, it was over. Tantalus looked down at the smoldering pile of ashes on the ground in front of him and spoke in a voice that shook the rubble at his feet.
That was for Rarity.